Hi everyone, I'm Bennett. I'm 29 years old and I live and work in Los Angeles. The story I'm about to tell you happened about 6 months ago, right at the Lafayette apartment complex where I had just moved in. At the time, I had only been in the area for about a month. Since I work as a freelancer from home, my world mostly revolved around my four walls and a computer screen. To keep myself from going stir-crazy, I started a habit of going out for a walk every evening. During those walks, I started noticing a woman who looked homeless. She wore filthy clothes, her hair was matted, and she usually sat on the ground in front of a nearby convenience store, chain smoking. Every now and then, she would give passers-by a very cold, unpleasant look. One day, I saw her getting into a heated argument with the store owner. The reason was simple. She didn't have any money, but was stubbornly demanding a pack of cigarettes. The owner, a pretty tough guy, lost his temper and started shouting. Eventually, he had to call the cops to get her removed. At the time, I just thought she was an out-of-control addict who was more pity than anything else. After that day, she disappeared for a while, and I almost completely forgot she existed. That was until one night when I was walking home late from a bar. As I passed the closed convenience store, I saw two silhouettes standing in a dark corner on the side of the building. They were making some suggestive noises, and I couldn't help my curiosity, so I stopped to look. I immediately realized it was the homeless woman and the store owner. They were standing very close to each other, and the vibe was incredibly strange and shady. She had her hand on his chest, something, while the owner stood perfectly still, seemingly accepting the touch. They looked like a couple having a secret affair. I found it hard to wrap my head around, but since it wasn't my business, I just kept walking home. A short time later, a shocking rumor started spreading through the apartment complex. The convenience store owner was dead. His body was found at his home in a state of heavy decomposition. The initial word on the street was that it was a suicide. I was stunned, thinking that maybe the pressures of life had finally pushed him over the edge. About 2 weeks after the owner's death, the homeless woman reappeared, and this time, she actively approached me. While I was out on my walk, she walked up to me, the heavy stench of cigarette smoke blowing right into my face. With a blank expression but a very suggestive tone, she asked me to buy her a pack of cigarettes because she was broke. Before I could even say no, she added a kicker. She promised she would do whatever I wanted in return. She even flashed me right there in the middle of the street. In that moment, I felt a mix of disgust and a strange sense of curiosity. I wasn't tempted by her appearance at all, but I wanted to know exactly what this trade was. I bought the cigarettes, and after she took them, she signaled for me to follow her. She led me into a dark alley. The deeper we went, the colder and quieter the air became. Near the end of the alley, I saw a car parked there. The lights were off and the windows were tinted, but I could clearly feel that someone was sitting inside, watching us. I started to hesitate and asked her again about the trade. She gave me a vague answer, intentionally dodging the question, and told me to just walk a little further. But ahead of us was a dead end in that suspicious car. When I firmly refused and turned to leave, her attitude flipped instantly. She grabbed my arm tight, her voice becoming frantic and pleading. She begged me to stay for just 5 more minutes. Right then, a massive alarm bell went off in my head. She didn't want to trade her body. She was trying to stall for time so the person in the car could make their move. I yanked my arm away and ran out of that alley with every bit of strength I had. Just seconds later, I heard a car door click open. I glanced back and saw a tall man stepping out of the vehicle. He stood perfectly still in the shadows, staring intently at my back as I fled. He didn't chase me, but his gaze was so cold that I'm convinced I just narrowly escaped a death sentence. I ran all the way home, locked the door tight, and collapsed on the floor. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would explode out of my chest. A few days later, the police released some of the investigation results regarding the store owner's murder. Once again, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. I was horrified. The owner hadn't committed suicide. He had been murdered in a blackmail or robbery trap. Everything immediately clicked in my mind based on what I had seen. That homeless woman was likely just the bait, and the man in the car was the one who actually did the deed. The store owner had probably been lured into a similar trade before, but he didn't get the chance to run like I did. I went to the police and told them the whole story, but the woman had vanished once again without a trace. To this day, the case remains unsolved. Whenever I look back on it, I still shudder, realizing that if I had been a little slower or just a bit more curious that night, I might not be sitting here to tell this story.
My name is Daniel. I was a delivery driver in New York City for nearly 6 years before I got caught up in a scam, lost my job, and ended up homeless. I lived on the streets, mostly hanging around the subway stations in Manhattan. During those dark months, I was lucky to have Vincent. Vincent was older than me. He always had a scruffy beard, and his jacket constantly smelled like old cigarettes. But he was kind and warm-hearted. We didn't ask about each other's pasts. We just treated each other with genuine respect. One day, Vincent told me he was heading down to the downtown area because tourists there were more likely to give out spare change. But after he left, nearly 2 days passed and he didn't come back. I started to get really restless. On the second night after Vincent left, I had a terrifying nightmare. I saw Vincent lying on the cold concrete, writhing in pain. His hands were clutching his stomach, and his face was twisted and purple from an unbearable agony. The dream worried me so much that the next morning, I decided to go look for him. I went to all his usual spots. I asked around the subway stations and checked the alleys where homeless people usually gathered, but nobody had any news about Vincent. Later that afternoon, while I was walking along a sidewalk, I heard a man scream in terror. He was another homeless man. He stumbled for a few steps and then collapsed. His body shook violently, his hands gripped his stomach, and his face became deformed with pain. Death came for him very quickly. The people around us just stood there, frozen in shock. I got goosebumps. The scene in front of me was exactly like the dream I had about Vincent. As it started to get dark, I headed back to my usual spot. My stomach was growling with hunger, and my feet were sore. Right then, I saw a well-dressed man standing on the corner handing out free sandwiches to the homeless. News about food travels fast. I walked over and received a neatly wrapped sub from him. I found a quiet corner, sat down, and shakily began to unwrap the paper. The smell of the meat made my mouth water. But just as I was about to take a bite, a voice whispered right in my ear, "Daniel, run." It was clearly Vincent's voice. I spun around, but there was nothing behind me but a brick wall. No one was there. While I was sitting there confused, another homeless man suddenly rushed at me. He snatched the sandwich right out of my hand and took off running. Hunger and anger flared up inside me, and I immediately chased after him. I caught up to him in a narrow, trash-filled alley behind a building. He had already managed to wolf down half of the sandwich. I was so frustrated that I punched him hard in the face and cursed at him. I turned to walk away, but after only a few steps, I heard a strange noise behind me. I looked back and was horrified to see the young man collapse. His body curled up, his hands gripped his stomach, and his moans faded away until he was silent. I stood there, paralyzed. I wasn't sure if he died because of the sandwich or because of my punch. Then I looked at his contorted body and the remains of the sandwich on the ground. It hit me like a ton of bricks. He had been poisoned. I hurried around to the back of the building to get away from the scene, and right there, in a dark corner next to some metal dumpsters, I saw a familiar shape. I walked closer, my legs shaking so hard I could barely stand. It was Vincent. He had passed away some time ago. His body was curled up, and his hands were clutching his stomach, exactly like in my dream. Next to his body was a scrap of a sandwich, exactly like the one I had just held, but it had already started to grow green mold. The shock was so great that my emotions felt frozen. I stared at Vincent for a long time, and everything that had happened over the last 2 days began to click together. I realized that the charitable man passing out sandwiches was actually a serial killer. His targets were homeless people like us, people whose deaths might go unnoticed or unremembered. Those free sandwiches were his murder weapons. Later, the police got involved when the number of deaths around the subway stations increased unusually fast. All the bodies were found in the same position, curled up, clutching their stomachs. I told the police everything I could remember about the man's face, but he had vanished without leaving a single trace. To this day, I still don't understand why he did it. Since that day, I have never accepted food from a stranger again. I eventually found a job moving crates and asked to sleep in the warehouse. I'm working hard to make sure my life is no longer defined by wandering the streets or the haunting fear of hunger. And I will always remember Vincent.
My name is Jason. For the past 15 years, I have lived with a silent, heavy haunting. Some things happen that make you regret them for the rest of your life. Not because of what you did, but because of what you chose to ignore. Back then, I was just a young guy starting my first real job. I struggled every day with the crowded New York City subways to get to work. I remember it was a late night, around 9 p.m. at the Times Square station. While I was waiting for my train, a middle-aged woman approached me. She looked pretty disheveled. Her hair was a mess, and her old clothes smelled like damp mold. She started with a very old script. She said she lost her wallet, had no money to get home, and asked for help. I had just started working and hadn't received a paycheck yet. I had exactly one $20 bill in my pocket. Seeing me hesitate, she suddenly lowered her voice, leaned into my ear, and made an insane offer that left me stunned. She asked for $10, and in exchange, she offered a special service. She signaled that I could touch her chest once. As she spoke, she tried to lure me into a deserted corner behind the station pillars. A chill went down my spine. I thought she must be a creep or mentally ill, so I quickly refused and bolted toward the platform as the train arrived. The story should have ended there, but a few days later, I went out for drinks with Eric, who was my best friend at the time. We were sitting at a small bar in Manhattan. We had quite a bit to drink, and as the alcohol started to kick in, I happened to spot that same woman sitting alone at the end of the bar. I pointed her out to Eric and told him about the creepy experience I'd had the other night. Eric burst out laughing. To him, a poor woman offering sex for money wasn't a big deal. It wasn't as scary as I was making it out to be. Eric even started making bets, daring to see if she would actually make the same offer to him. Before I could react, Eric took a big gulp of beer and walked straight toward her. He said a few words, then sat down in the chair next to her. They talked for a long time. She didn't look like she was flirting or being charming at all. After a few minutes, the smile disappeared from Eric's face. Then, the two of them leaned in close. Finally, Eric stood up and walked to the back of the bar with her. I was surprised, but I just sat there and waited. About 10 minutes later, Eric came back alone. He sat down in front of me and confirmed that she had made the exact same offer I described. But Eric's eyes looked a bit glazed over. Usually he was a fast talker, but right then, it took him several seconds to answer my questions. He insisted he was fine and finished the rest of his beer. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured he was just a little drunk, or that the woman had made him uncomfortable. We left the bar around midnight, and that was the last time I saw Eric. The next day, I got a call from his mother. She was worried, saying he hadn't come home, didn't show up for work, and his phone was off. By the end of the day, the police were involved. Months went by with no sign of Eric. Hope turned into exhaustion. There was no funeral and no answers for what happened. At first, I didn't dare tell the whole story about the woman, because I didn't even know what I was suspicious of. Later, I mentioned it to the police, But a story about a woman asking for money in exchange for a grope in a New York City subway station wasn't enough to be a real lead. More than a year later, when almost everyone thought Eric was dead, someone reported seeing a man who looked just like him at a subway station in Brooklyn. I went there with Eric's parents. The man huddled in the corner of the wall was indeed Eric. But it took me several minutes to believe it. He was thin, dressed in rags, and walked with a limp. His hair was hacked off unevenly, revealing patches of scarred scalp. On his wrists were thick calluses and circular scars. One of his arms was clearly weak. When he lifted it, he was slow and clumsy. Standing near Eric, I smelled a long-standing, damp body odor mixed with a sharp antiseptic scent, the kind of smell that only makes you think of a hospital. Eric didn't recognize his parents. He didn't even react when they called his name. His gaze was empty, as if his consciousness was gone. When he was taken to the hospital, the doctor said Eric had suffered a very serious head injury. His cognitive abilities were severely damaged and almost impossible to recover. His body also showed many signs of long-term physical abuse. In the hospital, I watched in horror as Eric chewed his food for a very long time, as if he didn't know how to swallow. Sometimes he would stuff his mouth full of food, his eyes darting around as if he was afraid someone would snatch it away. He even bit on paper towels, the corners of blankets, and anything within reach. All of his reflexes were off and distorted. The thing that haunts me the most is that Eric would mumble very quietly while chewing, $10 for one time, $10 for one time. Every time he said it, his hand would unconsciously reach forward as if he were begging for money. I stood there frozen, the blood in my veins turning to ice. That was the exact offer the woman at the Times Square station had made years ago. I went back to the station and asked some homeless people there. One man told me about a woman who specialized in luring men to follow her, especially young men who were drunk or curious. Those who went with her would be beaten until they were disabled, so they were easier to control, then used for begging. He said it wasn't a new story, it's just that no one ever has proof, and nobody really cares about the people who disappear in the subway. I realized with horror that from the moment Eric came back after those 10 minutes at the bar, he had probably been attacked or injected with some kind of drug. But because I was too drunk and too careless, I let my friend walk away in that dazed state. To this day, Eric lives in a care facility with the mind of a child. I still don't know exactly what happened to him during that missing year, but if I had just been firm and stopped him that night, everything might have been different.